Happy Wednesday, and welcome back to Conversation About Life. Especially life without the stay-at-home order, life as we know it now. And on Monday, I introduced to you that this week, as we talked about life, we're going to talk about the 5 most important things that we need to know and do so that we can move forward into this next chapter with God and that we can experience God with us this week and in the weeks coming. Quick recap. On Monday, we talked about not losing the blessings that we've received, talked about writing those down, keep them in front of us. Yesterday, talked about the need for us to be anchored in a way of life so that we are living with those blessings in our life. And today, I want to talk about the influence of disappointment in our lives. Now, let me preface that by saying that, my passion is spiritual direction. I love these podcast conversations, especially when I'm able to purely sit in the role of a spiritual director. I love talking to you about prayer. I love talking to you about God. I love talking to you about spiritual things. But for most of us, what influences our experience of God more than God is our experience of life. For most of us, it's the ordinary things of life that if we aren't aware of, they're going to creep up in our life. And what it's going to do is it's going to influence us on the inside. It's going to make us feel certain ways. And if we aren't aware of what's happening here, we aren't able to then receive from God, right? There's something blocking or there's something getting in the way. There's noise in the background, you might say, and that affects why we might be distracted in prayer. That affects why we're not feeling God the way that we used to feel God. Right, so it's the human things in life that have a huge influence over us, and that's why this week I just began to talk about the human things of life without the stay-at-home order, because it's those things, that have a huge influence in our relationship with God. And let me tell you one of the things that I think a lot of us have or will have to deal with if we're going to find God, right? And that is the influence of disappointment. Disappointment may not be as intense as other emotions, but disappointment can be more influential in our life than many other things. So let me give you a practical example. This past weekend, many of us were able to go back to Mass, right? It was the first weekend, at least in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux, where we were not only able to have Mass outdoors, but this past weekend, we were able to have Mass indoors. And for many of us, that was an awesome experience, right? For many of us, that was a beautiful opportunity to either see people we haven't seen or to just experience the liturgy and, of course, to receive the Eucharist. In conversation this past weekend with people who had been to Mass, and, my pastor's heart, my father's heart, my priestly heart was so looking forward to people celebrating their return to Mass. And I was in conversation with just people in my life, and I realized that we're all still struggling with things like wearing masks in church. And that's important. We have to do it, but it's different, isn't it? Or social distancing even within a church, right? We have to do it, but that it's just where we are. It just doesn't feel the same way, right? And even though, it was awesome to be back in the rhythm this weekend, it felt different for a lot of us, didn't it, right? And so I found myself this weekend really excited about what God was doing as we were all able to return to Mass. But on Sunday night, as I was going to bed, I felt this kind of like this malaise on my heart. I felt like this little fog, and I wasn't in the joyous mood on Sunday night that I was on Sunday morning. I wasn't in experience of consolation, right? Of going to bed with an easy and free heart. I was just kind of in a funky mood. And I didn't know why. The intensity of joy on Sunday morning was replaced with something that was not as intense as joy, but it was influencing the way I was affecting. And that was just the disappointment that we're not out the woods, that even though we were able to return to Mass, we with prudence and with great wisdom had to return to Mass with some limitations. And I was just disappointed that that's where we were. Now, why is that important? Because the disappointment, the way that I was feeling Sunday night, was robbing me of all the blessings that were there during the day. And those blessings were profound. But the disappointment, because I was blind to it and because I was not sharing it with God, was actually robbing the graces that God was giving me. Does that make sense? So disappointment has a huge influence. Like, we can be disappointed with life, that we still aren't out the woods yet. We can be disappointed with decisions that are made by other people. We can be disappointed with people inside our families. We can be disappointed with how they're responding to life right now. We can be disappointed with ourselves and not meeting our own standards. We can be either disappointed with the things of life or the people of life. And on a daily basis, you and I experience God. And on a daily basis, you and I experience disappointment. And if we're unaware of that, the disappointment kind of lingers on our hearts and begins to affect whether we are able to acknowledge and live in the blessings that God has given us. So what can you do practically at this stage of life? Well, first of all, just know that we're going to be disappointed, right? We're not out the woods yet, and we're probably not going to be out the woods with COVID-19 for a couple months. So any expectations that we have, if I were your spiritual director looking at you with love, I'd say, hey, in reality, we're not out the woods yet. And we're not going to be out the woods with COVID-19 and social distancing probably for a while. So we have to brace ourselves for the emotions that accompany enduring all of this as we are. Be prepared for a slower pace. I was at the grocery store the other day looking for some chicken, and I couldn't find any. I was looking at the grocery store looking for some 2-gallon Ziploc bags. I couldn't find any, right? Life is different. And as we adjust to life, and as we adjust to the ordinary disappointments of life, we just have to be aware of those things. So be aware of the fact that there's going to be disappointments of what has happened, what is happening, what may happen in the future. And what can you practically do with that? Number one, it's important for us at the end of every day just to survey our lives and say, where was I disappointed today? And number two, what am I doing with that? Again, at the end of every day, or if you pray in the morning, or if you're praying at lunch, whatever you're praying, look back on the previous 24 hours and just say, hey, where was I disappointed today? Because if we can just name that, we're aware of it, well, then we're more equipped, you might say, of what to bring to God. Number two, as we are aware of it, what are we doing with the disappointment? Some of us can kind of ruminate in it. Some of us can kind of stew in it. Or we can relate that to God. We can share that to God. And if you want some help there, here's what you can do. In the book of Psalms in the Old Testament, the reason why I often bring this there is because they are the writings of human beings talking about their human experience of God. And if you look at the psalm, there's often underneath the name of the psalm, Psalm 1, Psalm 20, Psalm 56, whatever it is. Underneath that, there's a little italicized description of what the psalm is like. And so if you look back on the day and you recognize that you're disappointed, just flip through the Psalms and find one where the description gives you a little bit of hope. And maybe just read that psalm, and then maybe those words can become your words. Now, if you got a little bit more time, you can take a word or phrase on that and then share that with God and have a conversation with God. But just be aware of what's going on in your life. Number two, share that with God so that you are able to Be free in that. And finally, just the last thing that I would recommend to you is just be aware of your expectations and how those expectations can influence us being disappointed. We've talked about expectations in the last couple of weeks, but I didn't want to lose that as we talk about the influence of disappointment, right? Life is never going to meet your expectations, neither am I or your people that you love or even yourself. And so don't be disappointed when life doesn't meet your expectations, because we're hoping for something that's never going to happen, right? There is grace in our life right now, right? But we just have to be on guard for the way that we can be disappointed. And if we are not blind to those disappointments, then I think we're going to be freer to find God with us, particularly at this time in our life. So here's your homework. Just add that little reflection at the end of the day. Be on guard for disappointments. Find a psalm every day that helps you pray with it, and trust that God is leading us in the process. 5 critically important things that we have discovered about our lives and about how God's leading us. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about what are some things that we can do to pray this week and over the next couple of weeks that are going to anchor us as we move forward, as we continue to talk about the 5 most important things in our life. Looking forward to that conversation tomorrow. Looking forward to returning with you. And until we see each other again, God bless you.